Well, let's start with the M2 MacBook Air, which obviously I think was probably if you want to call it, the flashiest announcement because of the fact that it's a new design, a nice new midnight blue color, which I personally would purchase if I was going to purchase this laptop, but we'll get to that in a minute. And obviously the launch of the new M2 chip, and they're really, although it's sort of an iterative update to the M series chips, it's still very impressive. It basically takes what the M1 did, which was brilliant, and sort of refine it with some additional features. The one thing that sort of stood out for me, at least in the M2 chip, before we talk about the Air, is the fact that they included a media encoding engine into the chip itself, which the M1 didn't have, which would make it better for things like video editing and any other, that type of work. Which again, that's why it caught my attention. But then there's also, looking at the MacBook Air, the design, like, it's ridiculously thin. It's taken on the design language of the higher tier MacBook Pros, but just in a much thinner form factor. And arguably, it's really for 95% of users, it's really the only Mac you really should be getting, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, look, with that added sort of graphics capacity, I mean, that unlocks everything for all the future applications. And we've spoken about this before, how, I guess for us now, 20 years ago, just being able to edit in sort of, standard definition video was the key to the future. It's now 4K, in some cases 8K. It's 3D rendering, for gaming, for graphics. And the fact that now we're seeing this range of Mac products with these capabilities, and I tell you what, in a MacBook Air, who would have even thought that this was possible? And this all comes down to this M chip, the Apple Silicon. This is a huge step, because this is opening up the next era of creativity, and it's going to show that Apple's right at the forefront of it. That's why I find all of these announcements this year particularly so interesting, because they really are focusing on the future applications, and not just, we've added a new feature, or updated the operating system.
Absolutely. I did want to touch on the fact that they also released basically another 13-inch MacBook Pro, but it's basically the same as the last one, just with the M2 chip installed. And I want to sort of mention that in context with the launch of the MacBook Air, because one of the reasons that back when the M1 MacBook Pro was announced first, I argued that to get that one if you had certain use cases. Like for me, the better...
which I did. Well done, Ben. Thank you.
The better battery, studio mics, better display. So there was, and I guess some more sustained performance with the fan, etc. But this time around, the M2 MacBook Air has closed the gap between a lot of those things, to the point where I can't see what the reason is to actually buy the 13-inch MacBook Pro with the M2 chip this time around, other than if there's a tiny market segment that Apple's identified as that they can still service. But the thing is that, and this is something I want to get into as well, is around the pricing structure, which that's not really a sexy topic in these types of announcements, but I actually think it's important to discuss, because if you're looking at just the base models, there's a linear progression as you go up the line, so it makes sense why one's less than the other, and etc. But once you start to custom config some of the Air, there's a version of the MacBook Air that is the same price as the MacBook Pro, where you have the same componentry in it. So then you're going, well, why would you buy the MacBook Pro? But crucially for me, and this is why I won't be buying the MacBook Air, because I am looking for an upgrade at some point. The one thing, the two things, I'll come back to the custom configuration pricing in a minute. But one thing is obviously the limitation of the one external display support, which to me seems totally arbitrary at this point. Obviously, that you have to buy the higher end MacBook Pros for that. But in the pricing structure, it also doesn't make sense to me because I want to get at least a 16 gigs of RAM, 512 gigs of storage for the next one that I get as a minimum. But if you custom config that on the Air, you're actually within a couple of $100 of the 14-inch MacBook Pro, which, even though it's got the M1 Pro chip, that's still a beefier chip than the M2, and you get a lot better hardware in the actual device as well, like significantly better. The display is much better, the SSDs are better, the mics are better, the speakers are better, and so it can lead to some confusion. Like for me, I didn't see any convincing case for me to buy an Air because where I would want it to get to satisfy storage requirements and whatever, I would just be better off getting the 14-inch MacBook Pro still. And I wonder if there's a lot of conversations like that people might have when they're looking at what they're going to buy, unless, of course, they're just going to buy a straight-up base model.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. So maybe, there's the segment of the market that will just buy the base level, and they browse and, maybe use a little bit of Office or something like that. But I suspect that maybe the purpose of that MacBook Air is to sell more 14-inch MacBook Pros. That's and wow, from what you've just said about the 14-inch MacBook Pro, I think I want one with the M2.
Absolutely. And the rumor mill suggesting that an M2 Pro version of that is coming out later in the year with any luck. So we'll see what happens from that.